Darkness. Imagine living in a world where night meant silence, shadow, and waiting. Streets lit only by weak candlelight. Homes filled with smoke from oil lamps, and voices unable to travel farther than the human ear could carry. Then, 3. Names changed everything. Thomas Edison, Nikola Tesla, Alexander Graham Bell. They lit up the night, carried voices across oceans, and unlocked a force that reshaped the modern world. Electricity. This is not just their story. It is the story of how the world you know today was born. If you enjoy drifting off to calm, fascinating history, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. It helps the channel, and it keeps more quiet journeys through time coming your way. Now, let's step back into the 19th century. Imagine for a moment stepping back into the early 19th century, into a world that feels both familiar and impossibly distant. The sun has slipped beneath the horizon, and with its disappearance, the very rhythm of life begins to slow. Darkness spreads quickly across towns and villages, settling like a heavy curtain over every street and every home. In our modern lives, we are surrounded by the glow of lamps, screens, and streetlights that banish the shadows at any hour. But in this older world, the absence of light was absolute. Once night arrived, the world changed. Streets grew silent, and uncertain houses flickered dimly with fragile flames, and work that depended on sight simply ended. It is difficult for us, accustomed to endless light on demand, to imagine what it meant to live in such a place. But for centuries, this was the ordinary reality of human existence. Light came only from fire, and fire itself was fragile, costly, and dangerous. Most homes relied on candles, often made from tallow animal fat, that filled the room with a smoky odor. For the poor, these were all they could afford, and so they rationed them carefully. A single candle might be lit in the evening to provide just enough glow to eat supper or to finish a small task. Children bent over their books or slates in the flickering light, eyes straining to follow words and numbers that blurred in the shadows. Wealthier families could afford beeswax candles, which burned more cleanly and gave a brighter light, but even they used them sparingly, aware of their cost. Oil lamps offered another option, fueled by whale oil, olive oil, or later kerosene, yet these too came with problems. Whale oil was difficult to obtain, requiring dangerous voyages to icy seas where men risked their lives to hunt enormous animals. The lamps themselves filled rooms with smoke, left soot on walls, and produced a dim circle of light surrounded by an ocean of darkness. Night in the streets was darker still. In smaller towns, when the sun set, the outside world became a place of uncertainty. Without electricity, there were no glowing signs, no rows of street lamps stretching down avenues, no headlights cutting through the dark. At best, a watchman might carry a lantern as he made his rounds, the small flame barely piercing the gloom. In larger cities, experiments with gas lamps had begun, and by the mid-1800s, some main streets of Paris, London, or New York glowed with an unfamiliar brightness. Yet even these were limited, costly, and often unreliable. Most neighborhoods and almost every small town remained dark. People avoided going out after sundown unless absolutely necessary. Stories circulated of thieves lurking in the shadows, of accidents on unlit roads, of fires breaking out from fallen lamps or sparks, The very landscape of life shrank each evening, reminding everyone of the natural limits of human control. Communication in this world was equally constrained. The human voice carried only as far as ears could hear, and no further. To share news across town, one relied on runners, messengers, or church bells. To reach someone far away meant writing a letter, sealing it with wax, and sending it on horseback or by ship. Messages took days, weeks, sometimes months to arrive. Imagine waiting anxiously for news of a relative, a friend, or a business partner, knowing that events might have already changed by the time the letter reached your hands. Wars could be fought and ended before families at home even knew they had begun. Births, marriages, and deaths became moments of joy or grief learned long after they had passed. There were mechanical systems such as semaphore towers with arms or flags signaling messages across hills and fields, but these were rare, expensive, and easily interrupted by fog or storm. For most of the world, silence stretched across distance. Like an unbroken sea, daily labor followed the rhythm of the sun. Factories and workshops opened their doors at dawn and closed at dusk, for candles and lamps could never truly replace daylight. Windows were made wide to capture as much natural light as possible, but shadows still filled corners, and workers strained their eyes in the gloom. Accidents were frequent, and productivity was limited by nature's schedule. Farmers, too, shaped their lives around sunrise and sunset. They rose early, worked in fields with the full strength of daylight, and returned home when shadows grew long. In winter, when days were short, so was work. In summer, when days stretched long, so did labor. The cycle of nature was unbending, and humanity adjusted to it. Domestic life was equally dependent on daylight. A housewife rose at dawn to tend to chores, cooking over wood-burning stoves, cleaning by hand, and preparing meals that took hours of effort. Laundry meant hauling water, heating it over a fire, and scrubbing clothes until hands ached. Children often helped while men worked in fields or shops. In the evening, when the sun went down, families gathered together in a small circle of candlelight. They read aloud, sang, played simple games, or told stories, the flame casting long shadows on the walls. Conversations were intimate, quiet, framed by the awareness that the wider world lay shrouded in darkness just outside the door. The night slowed life, imposed boundaries, and offered a kind of enforced rest that we, in our constantly glowing world, rarely experience. Night was more than just a physical reality. It was a psychological one. Darkness carried mystery, fear, and imagination. For centuries, cultures filled it with myths of spirits, thieves, and creatures lurking where eyes could not see. Night was a boundary line between safety and danger, between home and wilderness, between the known and the unknown. And yet, within that boundary lay wonder. Poets described the quiet beauty of the stars. Musicians found inspiration in the silence, and scientists asked themselves whether humanity could ever push back against the night. Was there a way to create a light that burned longer than a candle, brighter than a flame, safer than a lamp? Was there a force hidden in nature that could be harnessed to change everything? This was the world into which Thomas Edison, Nikola Tesla, and Alexander Graham Bell were born. Each came into a life shaped by the rhythms of daylight and darkness, of silence and waiting. Each grew up knowing the limits of their time, yet dreaming of possibilities that stretched beyond them. For Edison, the challenge was to make light practical, to give every home and every street the power to banish night. For Tesla, the dream was of invisible currents flowing like rivers through the air, carrying energy farther than anyone had imagined. For Bell, the question was how the human voice might travel beyond the range of an ear, how people separated by miles could speak as though they stood side by side. Before their inventions, the world was slower, quieter, darker. To truly understand the revolution they created, one must first imagine this silence, this slowness, this shadowed existence. The gift of electricity was not simply convenience, it was transformation. It expanded the day, carried voices across oceans, and gave humanity mastery over powers once thought divine. The revolution did not begin with glowing bulbs or ringing telephones, but with this world of waiting, where every candle burned low, every journey took days, and every word across distance meant delay. Only when we grasp the depth of that darkness can we appreciate the brilliance of the light that was to come. To understand how the electric revolution began, we must return to the earliest days of the men who would shape it, to the childhoods and formative years of Thomas Edison, Nikola Tesla, and Alexander Graham Bell. Their names now feel monumental, carved into the story of modern life like the foundations of a building. But once they were simply children born into a world that had no idea what transformations lay ahead. What is remarkable about each of them is not simply the brilliance of their inventions, but the path they took from ordinary beginnings to extraordinary achievements. Their lives, though different in character and in geography, began in the same world of candlelight and silence, and each boy looked at that world and saw not only what was, but what could be. Thomas Alva Edison was born in 1847 in the small town of Milan, Ohio. His family was not wealthy, and his father worked at various trades while his mother, a former school teacher, became the guiding influence of his childhood. Edison was not considered a promising student in the traditional sense. In fact, he was often thought of as a poor pupil, distracted and restless in the classroom. His teachers found him difficult, but his mother recognized a spark in him that others overlooked. She withdrew him from school and chose to educate him at home, giving him books, encouraging curiosity, and allowing him the freedom to follow his interests. Edison devoured volumes on science, mechanics, and history, and soon his curiosity expanded beyond the page. He set up a small laboratory in the family basement, where he experimented with chemicals, wires, and makeshift devices. He was still just a boy, but already he had begun a lifelong pattern of learning not by theory alone, but by doing, by testing, by taking apart and rebuilding. His world was not defined by the limitations around him, but by the possibilities he sensed in every question. Yet Edison's childhood was not free from struggle. He suffered from hearing problems, and as he grew older, he became almost completely deaf in one ear. Some have suggested this pushed him even further inward, forcing him to concentrate more deeply and to block out distraction. To others, his deafness was a disadvantage he simply learned to overcome. What cannot be denied is that it shaped the way he saw the world, giving him an intensity of focus that would later be one of his greatest strengths. As a teenager, he worked on trains, selling newspapers and snacks to passengers. And even here he carried his restless inventiveness. In the baggage car, he built another small laboratory, conducting experiments as the train rattled across the countryside. This constant mingling of work and curiosity, of practicality and imagination, became the pattern of his life. While Edison's beginnings unfolded in the United States, across the Atlantic another child entered the world who would one day challenge his ideas and offer a different vision of electricity. Nikola Tesla was born in 1856 in the village of Smiljan, in what was then the Austrian Empire and is now Croatia. Unlike Edison, who grew up in a modest but literate home, Tesla's family carried an intellectual tradition. His father was a priest and writer, and his mother, though never formally educated, had a talent for inventing simple household tools. From her, Tesla inherited not only mechanical skill, but also a restless imagination. He later credited his mother as the true source of his inventive spirit. From an early age, Tesla showed signs of unusual intellect and perception. He experienced vivid visions and mental images, sometimes so strong they interfered with his daily life. These visions, however, also gave him the remarkable ability to design and test inventions entirely in his mind before ever building them. Where others sketched and constructed, Tesla could run machines in his imagination, watching them operate, detecting flaws, and correcting them without lifting a tool. He was tall, slender, and intense, with a sense of otherworldliness that set him apart even as a boy. His fascination with energy and power revealed itself early. He watched water wheels turn in rivers and wondered how invisible forces might be harnessed in other ways. Unlike Edison, who would learn through trial and error, Tesla cultivated a visionary gift, seeing possibilities far beyond what most around him could imagine. Tesla's youth was also marked by hardship. His family expected him to follow in his father's footsteps and enter the priesthood, but his heart was drawn to science. When illness nearly claimed his life as a young man, he convinced his father to allow him to study engineering if he survived. He did survive, and soon he was enrolled in technical schools where his brilliance became undeniable. Teachers were astonished by his ability to memorize entire books, to solve complex equations in his head, and to invent on the spot. Yet he was restless, moving from school to school, often at odds with authority, always chasing bigger questions. Poverty and personal tragedy followed him too. His beloved older brother died in a riding accident, a loss that haunted Tesla throughout his life. From the very beginning, his path was shaped not only by intellect, but by grief, determination, and the sense that he was destined for something larger than himself. While Edison and Tesla were beginning their journeys, another boy was growing up in Scotland who would add an entirely different dimension to the coming revolution. Alexander Graham Bell was born in 1847, the very same year as Edison, in the city of Edinburgh. His family background was steeped in the study of speech and sound. His father and grandfather were both experts in elocution, the art of clear speech, and his father developed techniques to teach the deaf how to speak. Bell grew up in a household filled with the music of language, with experiments in sound, and with a deep respect for communication as both a science and an art. From his earliest days, Bell showed curiosity about the mechanics of sound. He built simple devices with his brothers, such as talking tubes that could carry voices across distances within the house. He listened to the vibrations of instruments, fascinated by the way invisible waves moved through the air. His mother, who began losing her hearing when he was young, became another influence, for Bell longed to help her connect more fully to the world of sound. This personal connection to hearing and deafness shaped his lifelong passion to make the human voice travel beyond its natural limits. Unlike Edison and Tesla, whose imaginations focused on light and energy, Bell's imagination was tuned to sound itself, to the vibrations that carried meaning between people. Bell's path was not straightforward. He struggled in school, preferring practical tinkering to formal study, but his father recognized his potential and involved him in teaching the deaf, passing down his methods. Eventually, the family moved to Canada and then to the United States, seeking healthier air for Bell's brothers who suffered from tuberculosis. It was in this new land that Bell's inventive spirit flourished, surrounded by a world that was beginning to experiment with electricity. He began to wonder, if electricity could carry a signal for the telegraph, could it also carry the subtle waves of the human voice? Thus, from 3 different corners of the world, 3 children grew into young men shaped by curiosity, by hardship, and by vision. Edison, the restless tinkerer who turned setbacks into experiments. Tesla, the visionary who saw machines spinning in the theater of his mind. Bell, the communicator who sought to give voice across silence. Each was profoundly influenced by family Edison, by a mother who believed in him when schools did not. Tesla by a mother who modeled invention in daily life, and Bell by a father who devoted his career to the mysteries of speech. Each carried burdens: Edison's deafness, Tesla's poverty and visions, Bell's loss of family members to illness. But these burdens became fuel for ambition. It is striking to realize how ordinary their beginnings appeared at the time. None were born into wealth or great power. They were not heirs to dynasties of kings or generals. They were, in many ways, ordinary boys, shaped by the same limitations as everyone around them: the darkness of night, the slowness of communication, the boundaries of daily life. And yet, within each of them stirred the conviction that those limits were not final. They sensed, perhaps dimly at first, that forces greater than fire and wind might be harnessed, that human ingenuity could bend nature in ways previously unimagined. The 19th century was an age of change, and it was into this climate that they stepped. Railroads were stretching across continents, steam engines were driving industry, and scientific societies were buzzing with experiments in electricity and magnetism. The stage was being set, and these 3 young men, each in his own way, would rise to meet it. Looking back, it seems inevitable that Edison, Tesla, and Bell would leave their mark on history. But in their youth, nothing was guaranteed. Edison could have remained a restless train boy. Tesla could have been confined to obscurity in a provincial corner of Europe, and Bell might have simply continued his father's work in teaching speech without ever pushing further. What united them was not certainty but persistence, not privilege but imagination. They looked at the same candles, the same oil lamps, the same letters carried by post, and they refused to accept that such limits were all humanity would ever know. The birth of these 3 minds did not mark the beginning of electricity. Itself, scientists before them had already studied sparks and currents, but it did mark the beginning of electricity as we know it. Electricity, not as a curiosity, but as a force that would transform human life. When people today think of Thomas Edison, one invention almost always rises above the rest: the light bulb. It has become a symbol not just of his work, but of invention itself, the shining bulb appearing in cartoons and books as the emblem of a sudden idea. Yet the story of how Edison brought electric light into homes and cities is not one of a single brilliant moment, but of years of relentless struggle, endless trials, countless failures, and an almost superhuman refusal to give up. To understand the magnitude of his achievement, one must remember that light was not merely convenience. It was survival, productivity, and progress. The world longed for a safer, steadier, and brighter source of illumination, but no one had, yet managed to capture it in a way that ordinary families could use. That was the battle Edison chose to fight, and it would define his legacy. By the time Edison turned his attention to electric light in the late 1870s, it was already well known as an inventor. He had developed the phonograph, a device that astonished the public by capturing and replaying sound. Newspapers called him the Wizard of Menlo Park, after his laboratory in New Jersey, where he and his team of assistants worked day and night on experiments. Edison thrived on publicity, often inviting journalists into his lab, and he knew that the idea of replacing candles and gas lamps with electricity captured the imagination of the world. But the problem was immense. Others had tried before him, and though a few had managed to create electric light in laboratories, no one had succeeded in making it practical, safe, and affordable for everyday use. The basic principle was simple. Enough. Pass electricity through a filament and it would glow, but the execution was brutally difficult. Filaments burned out almost instantly. Glass bulbs shattered or blackened with soot. Power sources overheated, sparks flew, and the entire system seemed dangerous and unreliable. What Edison realized was that inventing the light bulb was not just about creating a lamp. It was about building an entire system that would deliver power, regulate it safely, and keep the bulb glowing for hours instead of seconds. He was not merely inventing an object. He was inventing a network, an infrastructure that would change the way cities were built. Edison approached the problem in his characteristic style, with persistence and a willingness to try every possibility. He and his team experimented with thousands of materials for filaments. They tried metals, plant fibers, and even human hair. Each test brought failure, but each failure brought knowledge. Edison famously remarked that he had not failed, but rather discovered thousands of things that did not work. His laboratory became a place of endless trial and error, with assistants recording every detail, adjusting conditions, and trying again. The air was thick with smoke from burned filaments, and the work was exhausting, but Edison's energy seemed inexhaustible. He drove his team hard, often working through the night, snatching only a few hours of sleep in a chair. He believed that success was close, that the answer was out there waiting to be uncovered, and his determination was contagious. At last, after years of effort, Edison made his breakthrough in 1879. The key was a filament made from carbonized bamboo, which glowed steadily for more than 1,000 hours when enclosed in a vacuum-sealed glass bulb. It was not the first electric light ever created, but it was the first practical one, the first that could last long enough to be useful in homes and businesses. With this discovery, Edison could finally show the world that electric lighting was not just a laboratory trick, but a real possibility. Demonstrations at Menlo Park drew huge crowds. Visitors gasped as rooms lit up with a steady, white glow that seemed almost magical compared to the weak flames of candles or gas lamps. Newspapers across the country reported on the marvel, and Edison's fame grew even greater. Yet the invention of the bulb was only half the battle. For it to truly change the world, Edison needed to build a way to deliver electricity safely to thousands of lamps at once. This required the design of generators, wiring systems, switches, and meters. He envisioned an entire grid where power stations would supply energy through underground wires, lighting up whole districts. It was an audacious idea far beyond what most people thought possible. Skeptics scoffed, insisting it would never be practical, that gaslight was good enough, that electricity was too dangerous. But Edison pressed on, raising money from investors and building prototypes. In 1882, his vision became reality in New York City when the Pearl Street Station began supplying electric power to a square mile of lower Manhattan. Hundreds of lamps flickered to life in homes, offices, and businesses. People gathered in the streets to witness the transformation, marveling at the glow that poured from windows. It was as though daylight had been captured and brought indoors. The success of the Pearl Street system proved that electric light could work not just in theory but in practice, and soon other cities clamored for their own power stations. Edison's invention was spreading, and with it, the world was beginning to change. The impact was profound. Factories that once shut down at dusk could now operate late into the night, increasing production. Shops and theaters stayed open longer, bringing new life to urban evenings. Families read and work under steady light, no longer straining their eyes by candle. Fires caused by lamps and candles declined, and the streets grew safer with electric lamps glowing on corners. The rhythm of human life began to shift, no longer tied so strictly to the rise and fall of the sun. For the first time in history, night was no longer an impenetrable boundary. Yet Edison's battle for the light bulb was not without controversy. He became fiercely protective of his invention, filing patents and engaging in lawsuits against competitors. He also faced criticism for the cost of his systems, which at first only wealthy families and businesses could afford. Rivals argued that his design for direct current power was inefficient, and others began to promote alternating current as a superior method. But those battles belonged to the next chapter of history, when Edison would face his greatest rival in Nikola Tesla. For now, what mattered was that Edison had done what countless others had failed to do. He had given the world a light that lasted, a light that was safe, and a light that could be multiplied across cities. His relentless drive, his willingness to test failure after failure, and his vision of an entire electrical system had changed the way humanity lived. The invention of the light bulb was more than just a technological triumph. It was a turning point in civilization itself. It symbolized the power of human ingenuity to conquer darkness, to expand the boundaries of possibility, and to reshape the very nature of daily life. As we look back on Edison's battle for the light bulb, it is tempting to imagine it as inevitable, as though the world was simply waiting for someone to discover the right filament. But in truth, the achievement was anything but certain. It required a mind that refused to stop at failure, a team that endured endless nights of labor, and a vision that stretched beyond a single object to an entire system. Without Edison's determination, the glow that now fills every street and home might have been delayed by decades. The light bulb was not just an invention. It was a revolution captured in glass, a promise of progress that illuminated the path. A head dot, and so with the flick of a switch, the modern world was born. In the spring of 1876, in a modest laboratory cluttered with wires, coils, and odd pieces of metal, Alexander Graham Bell leaned anxiously over a strange contraption. It hardly looked like the world-changing invention it was meant to be. A wooden stand, a funnel-shaped mouthpiece, and wires that stretched across the room gave little hint of the revolution it contained. Yet when Bell raised his voice and spoke into the mouthpiece, the words that came out were destined to echo across centuries. "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you." They were not poetic, not dramatic, but they were extraordinary, for they were the first intelligible words ever transmitted by telephone. On the other end of the line, his assistant, Thomas Watson, heard his employer's voice carried not by air, but by electricity, traveling along a wire and vibrating into sound again. In that moment, the boundary of distance began to crumble, and humanity's ability to communicate was transformed forever. The telephone was not born in a vacuum. The mid-19th century was already a time of remarkable progress in communication. Samuel Morse's telegraph had proven that electrical signals could carry coded messages across wires. For the first time, news could travel faster than the fastest ship or horse, transmitted as dots and dashes across continents and oceans. Yet the telegraph had limits. It required skilled operators trained to interpret the code, and its language was not the natural flow of human speech. Bell, shaped by his family's long tradition of studying sound and speech, dared to imagine more. If electricity could carry signals, why not the very vibrations of the human voice itself? Why not capture the tones, the inflections, the laughter, the emotion of spoken language and send it instantly to someone far away? Bell's fascination with sound came from childhood. His father, Alexander Melville Bell, was a respected teacher of elocution who devised visible speech, a system of symbols to represent vocal sounds intended to help deaf people learn to speak. Young Bell grew up in this atmosphere of experimentation, with the human voice learning to think of speech not just as words, but as vibrations of air, patterns that could perhaps be studied, measured, and imitated. His mother's growing deafness gave him even deeper motivation. To her, he would speak slowly and clearly, and he longed to find a way to bridge the silence that isolated her. His work, then, was never only about machines. It was about connection, about the human need to share thoughts and feelings across barriers. As a young man, Bell pursued studies in anatomy, physiology, and acoustics, all with an eye toward sound. He became a teacher of the deaf, bringing his father's methods to students in Canada and later the United States. Among his pupils was Mabel Hubbard, who had lost her hearing to scarlet fever as a child. She would later become his wife, and her encouragement, along with the influence of her wealthy family, gave Bell both personal and financial support in his experiments. Surrounded by an environment of education, speech, and love, Bell pushed forward his dream of transmitting voice electrically. The challenge was immense. sound is continuous and complex, while the telegraph worked by simple interruptions of current. To send speech required a way of converting the vibrations of air into electrical signals that could travel along a wire and then back into vibrations again. Bell tinkered endlessly, sketching designs, building crude prototypes, and experimenting with membranes and magnets. His assistant Watson was indispensable, turning Bell's ideas into physical models and sharing his restless enthusiasm. They worked in cramped workshops, often with little more than scraps of wood and wire, struggling to make the invisible waves of sound into something tangible. Competition was fierce. Others were also chasing the idea of a talking telegraph, most notably Elisha Gray, an inventor who came close to filing a patent at the same time as Bell. The race was intense, filled with rumors, legal maneuverings, and controversy that would later erupt into bitter disputes over credit. But on that March day in 1876, it was Bell who achieved the breakthrough. The words he spoke to Watson were scratchy, imperfect, but unmistakable. For the first time in history, a voice had traveled across an electrical wire. News of the invention spread rapidly. Demonstrations followed, first in lecture halls and then in exhibitions. Crowds gathered to witness the marvel, leaning forward in amazement as they heard a distant voice emerge from a receiver. Many could scarcely believe it. The idea that one person could speak in one room and be heard in another without shouting seemed like sorcery. Some were skeptical, dismissing it as a toy or a novelty with little practical use. But others immediately sensed its potential. The telegraph had already changed the pace of business and news. The telephone promised to change the very nature of conversation. The following years were a blur of growth. The Bell Telephone Company was founded in 1877, backed by investors who recognized the value of this strange device. Early telephones were clumsy, with wires stretching awkwardly between buildings, but businesses quickly saw their usefulness. Orders could be placed instantly, instructions given without delay, and emergencies addressed without waiting for a messenger. Doctors could be summoned more quickly, factories could coordinate more efficiently, and families could hear the voices of loved ones without waiting for the post. Yet the adoption of the telephone was not immediate or universal. Many resisted the change, suspicious of the new technology. Some feared that eavesdroppers could listen in, while others worried that constant communication would disrupt social norms. Farmers in rural areas saw little need for it at first, relying on traditional methods. But slowly, steadily, the network expanded. Wires spread across cities, connecting neighborhoods, offices, and homes. Switchboards were established, staffed by operators who manually connected calls by plugging wires into boards, their voices becoming the unseen link between distant speakers. Bell himself remained deeply engaged with both the science of sound and the growth of his company, though he was never as relentless a businessman as Edison. His interests extended to many fields, from aeronautics to education for the deaf. Yet the telephone remained his greatest legacy. It embodied his lifelong passion to make sound travel beyond the limits of the ear, to bridge the silence of distance, and to bring people closer through the simple act of speaking. The significance of Bell's first words cannot be overstated. They were not only a technical achievement, but a cultural turning point. Before the telephone, communication at a distance was impersonal, reduced to written words or coded signals. After the telephone, human voices could be heard directly, with all their emotion, tone, and immediacy. The world became more intimate, more connected, and in many ways smaller. A father could hear his child's laughter from miles away. A business partner could negotiate without travel, and friends could share their thoughts as though they sat together, even when oceans separated them. Looking back now, the telephone seems inevitable, just as the light bulb does. But at the time, it was a fragile invention, uncertain in its path, surrounded by skeptics and pursued by rivals. It was Bell's persistence, his grounding in the science of sound, his personal motivation to help the deaf, and his partnership with Watson that made it real. The first words spoken across a wire were not grand declarations or scientific jargon. They were simple, human, urgent words. "Come here, I want to see you." And perhaps that is the perfect symbol of what the telephone would always be about: the desire for connection, the longing to close the gap of distance, the need to bring voices together. From that modest laboratory in 1876, a chain of events began that would stretch across the globe. In time, telephones would link cities, nations, and continents. Undersea cables would carry voices beneath oceans. Satellites would one day beam calls through the sky. And eventually, in our modern age, a device small enough to fit in a pocket would carry not only voices but pictures, words, and entire libraries. But it all began with that first scratchy sentence, spoken into a crude instrument, received with astonished ears, and remembered as the spark of a revolution in communication. Alexander Graham Bell's telephone did not simply invent a device. It invented a new way of being human in the modern world. Nikola Tesla's life was shaped by visions that he claimed would come to him in sudden flashes of light, vivid images that unfolded in his mind with a clarity that left him restless until he tried to build them. Unlike many inventors who tinkered their way toward discovery, Tesla lived in a world of imagination so powerful that he could picture machines in detail, watch them turn and function in his mind, and even hear the hum of their movements before a single piece of metal was touched. His gift, both extraordinary and tormenting, set him apart from the world around him and gave rise to inventions that carried humanity further into the electric age than almost anyone dared to dream. If Edison embodied persistence and Bell represented the power of connection, Tesla was the visionary who saw electricity not just as a tool, but as a vast, flowing ocean of energy waiting to be harnessed. His obsession with currents, especially alternating current, or AC, would change the modern world. Tesla was born in 1856 in the small village of Smoljan, in what is now Croatia, then part of the Austrian Empire. The night of his birth was marked, according to family stories, by a violent lightning storm. His mother, weary from labor, was told by a midwife that the storm was a bad omen, but she replied that her son would be a child of light. Whether fact or legend, the story seems to foreshadow the path his life would take. His father was a priest and writer, hoping Tesla would follow him into the church, but his mother, though never formally educated, had a remarkable gift for invention, creating household tools and weaving devices that amazed her neighbors. From her, Tesla inherited not only a sharp mind, but also a restlessness that drove him toward creation. He often said that whatever skill he possessed came from his mother's side. Even as a boy, Tesla was fascinated by the forces of nature. He marveled at water wheels turning in rivers, studied the way storms moved across the sky, and played with the static shocks produced by combing his hair in the dry air. He also struggled with strange experiences. He described visions that appeared so vividly in his mind that they seemed real. A word, a sound, or even a memory could trigger images he could not control. At times these visions tormented him, but they also gave him an extraordinary ability. He could hold an invention in his imagination, rotate it, adjust its parts, and test it entirely in his mind. This ability allowed him to perfect designs without endless trial and error, a contrast to Edison's experimental approach, where Edison would test thousands of filaments to find the right one. Tesla would design the entire machine in thought, watching it work until he knew it would succeed. Tesla's education took him to technical schools in Graz and Prague, where he studied engineering and physics. He excelled in mathematics and electrical theory, impressing his professors with his memory and his ability to perform complex calculations mentally. Yet he was restless and often at odds with authority. He would vanish from classes for days, consumed by private experiments, and he left more than one school before completing formal degrees. He was a man who learned on his own terms, never content to follow paths already laid out. During this time, he encountered the idea of alternating current. Most electrical experiments of the day focused on direct current, where electricity flowed steadily in one direction. Alternating current, which reversed direction many times per second, was considered impractical by many scientists. But Tesla saw in it the key to transmitting power over long distances. Direct current, as Edison was promoting it at a fatal limitation. It could not travel far without losing strength. This meant power stations had to be close to the homes and businesses they served, making it impractical for widespread distribution. Alternating current, however, could be transformed to higher or lower voltages using devices called transformers, allowing it to travel miles across wires before being used. In Tesla's mind, this meant entire cities, even entire nations, could be powered from a few large generating stations. He imagined rivers harnessed to produce electricity that would flow invisibly across the landscape, lighting homes, running factories, and freeing humanity from the limits of fire and steam. Tesla's obsession with a sea would define his career, but his early years were filled with struggle. After working briefly in Europe, he made his way to the United States in 1884, arriving in New York with little more than a letter of introduction and 4 cents in his pocket. America was a land of opportunity, buzzing with energy, industry, and invention, but it was also a place of fierce competition, where ideas clashed as violently as the currents Tesla studied. Soon he found himself working briefly for Thomas Edison, a partnership that might have seemed natural, but quickly soured. Edison favored direct current and dismissed Tesla's theories about alternating current as impractical. Tesla, frustrated by Edison's resistance and by disputes over promised pay, left to pursue his own path. It was not an easy path. Tesla struggled financially, often working menial jobs and sometimes digging ditches to survive. Yet even in hardship, his mind was alive with invention. He sketched designs for motors that could run on alternating current, machines that others insisted were impossible. In 1887, he finally succeeded in building a working AC motor, a sleek, elegant device that ran smoothly without sparking or wearing itself down. Demonstrated before engineers, it astonished those who saw it. The concept that electricity could alternate, reversing its flow thousands of times per second, and still drive powerful machinery, was revolutionary. This invention would become the foundation of the modern power system. Tesla's ideas soon caught the attention of George Westinghouse, an industrialist and inventor who recognized the potential of alternating current. Westinghouse believed in Tesla's vision of long-distance power transmission and purchased his patents, bringing Tesla into his company. With Westinghouse's resources and Tesla's genius, the battle against Edison's direct current empire began in earnest. This war of currents, as it came to be known, would dominate the 1880s and 1890s, shaping the future of electricity. But beneath the business rivalry lay Tesla's unshakable belief in the power of AC, not just as a technical advantage, but as the natural way electricity should flow. Tesla spoke of electricity almost as if it were a living force. He imagined currents moving like invisible rivers through wires, filling cities with energy as naturally as water-filled reservoirs. He dreamed not only of lighting homes, but of transmitting power wirelessly, of sending signals and energy through the air itself. Many of these visions seemed fantastical at the time, bordering on science fiction, yet they revealed his boundless imagination. He saw the world not as it was, but as it could be, connected by invisible waves of power. In 1893, his alternating current system achieved a decisive triumph when Westinghouse won the contract to light the world's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. For 6 months, more than 27 million visitors walked through dazzling halls, illuminated by thousands of electric lamps powered by Tesla's AC system. The sight was breathtaking, entire buildings glowing as if filled with captured daylight. Fountains lit with colored lights, machinery running smoothly, without smoke or flame. The fair was more than a spectacle. It was a declaration that alternating current was the future. Edison's direct current seemed suddenly old-fashioned, limited, and impractical by comparison. Tesla's greatest demonstration of AC power came with the harnessing of Niagara Falls. For centuries, the thunderous cascade had been admired as a wonder of nature, but Tesla and Westinghouse envisioned it as a source of limitless energy. In 1896, their hydroelectric power plant began transmitting electricity from the falls to the city of Buffalo, New York, more than 20 miles away. It was a moment of triumph for Tesla's vision. Energy from a natural source had been captured, converted, and delivered over long distances, proving that alternating current could power the modern world. For Tesla, however, AC was only the beginning. He dreamed of wireless power that could be transmitted without wires at all. He experimented with high-frequency currents, building strange coils that produced crackling sparks and glowing discharges. Visitors to his laboratory described the eerie beauty of bulbs lighting up while held in the hand, powered by unseen waves in the air. Though practical wireless power remained elusive, Tesla foresaw technologies that would one day become reality. Radio, remote control, and global communication. In this sense, his visions extended far beyond the present, reaching into the age we live in now. Yet Tesla's brilliance was often shadowed by personal difficulty. He was eccentric, prone to obsessive habits, and careless with money. He gave away lucrative patents, missed business opportunities, and spent vast sums on experiments that seemed impractical. While Edison built a fortune and Bell managed a successful company, Tesla struggled with financial instability. He was more dreamer than businessman, more visionary than pragmatist. But his genius was undeniable, and his alternating current system remains the foundation of modern electrical power. The history of electricity is filled with discovery, innovation, and progress, but it is also filled with rivalry. Few rivalries in the modern age have been as dramatic, as bitter, and as consequential as the one between Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla. It was not simply a contest of personalities or egos. It was a war over the very nature of electricity itself, over how it should be generated, transmitted, and used. At stake was not just scientific pride, but the future of power distribution across the world. On one side stood Edison, the established inventor, a man of relentless energy and practical genius, championing direct current or DC. On the other stood Tesla, the visionary, the dreamer, the outsider who believed alternating current or AC was the true future. What unfolded in the 1880s and 1890s became known as the War of Currents, a struggle fought not only in laboratories and lecture halls, but in newspapers, courtrooms, and even in public spectacles designed to sway opinion. It was a war of ideas, of business, of science, and of ambition. And in the end, it would determine the system of electricity that still powers the modern world. Edison's direct current system had the advantage of being first. He had built his Pearl Street station in New York City in 1882, proving that electricity could be generated in one place and distributed to many homes and businesses. The sight of entire neighborhoods glowing with steady light had cemented his reputation as the Wizard of Menlo Park. But DC had limitations that were difficult to ignore. Direct current traveled poorly over long distances. It lost energy as it moved through wires, meaning that power stations had to be built close to the customers they served. For a growing city, this meant dozens of small stations would be required, an expensive and inefficient arrangement. Edison knew this, but believed the problem could be solved with incremental improvements. He was committed to DC, partly because it was his invention, partly because it was already in use, and partly because he distrusted the alternative. Tesla, however, saw electricity differently. His alternating current system allowed power to be transformed to high voltages for long-distance transmission, then stepped down to safe levels for use in homes and businesses. This made it far more practical for covering large areas, and Tesla envisioned entire regions powered by a few generating stations. He believed AC was not only superior, but essential for electricity to become truly universal. But Tesla was not a businessman. His early efforts to promote AC floundered until he partnered with George Westinghouse, an industrialist who shared his vision and had the resources to back it. With Westinghouse's company buying Tesla's patents and employing his designs, AC suddenly had powerful champions. Edison saw this as a direct threat. The spread of AC would undermine his entire business empire, his patents, and his reputation. Determined to defend DC, Edison launched a campaign not just of technical competition, but of persuasion, even fear. He argued that alternating current was dangerous, too powerful, too unstable. To prove his point, he organized public demonstrations in which animals were electrocuted with a C, from stray dogs and cats to, most notoriously, an elephant named Topsy in 1903, though that came years after the war's height. These spectacles shocked and horrified the public, but also left a lasting impression. AC was not only a rival technology but a potential killer. Edison believed that by associating alternating current with danger, he could sway public opinion in favor of his safer, more familiar DC systems. Tesla, meanwhile, was not a man who thrived on public spectacle. He preferred the laboratory, the quiet hum of machines, the visions that filled his mind. Yet he too understood the need to demonstrate AC's power. At lectures and exhibitions he produced dazzling shows, coils crackling with sparks, lamps glowing without wires, currents passing harmlessly through his body to light bulbs in his hands. Where Edison relied on fear, Tesla relied on wonder. He showed that AC was not only practical, but magical, capable of feats beyond the imagination of his audience. The rivalry escalated as cities across America debated which system to adopt. For local distribution in small areas, DC could suffice. But for larger cities and industries, the efficiency of a C was undeniable. The ultimate test came in 1893, when the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago sought to light its grand fairgrounds with electric light. Westinghouse, using Tesla's AC system, won the contract over Edison's company. For 6 months, millions of visitors walked beneath boulevards illuminated by alternating current. The effect was breathtaking. A city within a city glowing brighter than any had ever seen. The victory was not only technical, but symbolic. AC had lit the future, and DC seemed suddenly old-fashioned. The decisive blow came with the harnessing of Niagara Falls. For decades, engineers had dreamed of capturing the immense power of the falls to generate electricity. The contract was fiercely contested, with Edison promoting DC and Tesla, and Westinghouse championing AC. In the end, AC won. When the first power plant at Niagara began transmitting electricity to Buffalo, 20 miles away, it proved beyond doubt that alternating current was capable of large-scale power transmission. Edison's dream of a DC world collapsed under the weight of physics and practicality. Yet even as AC triumphed, the rivalry left scars. The smear campaigns against Tesla and Westinghouse had tarnished reputations. Tesla himself, though vindicated scientifically, did not reap the financial rewards he might have. He had sold many of his most valuable patents to Westinghouse, and though he gained fame, he never achieved the wealth of Edison. Edison, for his part, eventually conceded the rise of a C, though he never openly admitted defeat. He moved on to other inventions, leaving behind a system that would quietly fade from dominance. The war of currents was more than just a business dispute. It was a clash of philosophies. Edison embodied the pragmatic inventor, willing to test, build, and sell what worked in the moment, regardless of elegance. Tesla embodied the visionary who saw systems whole, who imagined electricity as a boundless force that could reshape the world. Edison believed in persistence, in grinding through trial and error until something useful emerged. Tesla believed in inspiration, in flashes of insight that revealed entire machines in his mind. Both approaches had merit, but in this war, Tesla's vision proved more aligned with reality. Looking back, it is easy to imagine the war of currents as inevitable, as though AC was always destined to win. But in the heat of the 1880s, nothing was certain. Edison had power, money, and fame on his side. Tesla had ideas that many dismissed as impractical dreams. That alternating current triumphed was due not only to Tesla's brilliance, but also to Westinghouse's willingness to support him, to fight against entrenched interests, and to gamble on a future others could not yet see. Today, the world is powered by AC. Every time a switch is flipped, every time electricity flows across miles of wire from distant generating stations, it is Tesla's victory that we live with. Yet Edison's legacy remains as well, for he was the one who proved electricity could light homes and streets in the first place. The war of currents was not simply about winners and losers. It was about the messy, dramatic process by which human progress is made. Out of rivalry came innovation, out of conflict came clarity, and out of two competing visions came the system that powers modern life. The war left Tesla scarred and Edison embittered, but it left the world illuminated. And perhaps that is the truest measure of its outcome. The war of currents was not fought only in newspapers, boardrooms, and lecture halls. It was fought in the streets, in public squares, and in exhibition halls where ordinary people gathered to watch spectacles that were as terrifying as they were fascinating. Electricity was still a mystery to most in the late 19th century. To many it was an invisible, almost magical force that few understood and many feared. Inventors, businessmen, and showmen knew this, and they used public demonstrations, sometimes theatrical, sometimes brutal, to sway opinion. The battlefield was as much the imagination of the public as it was the pages of scientific journals, and both Edison and Tesla turned to demonstration as a weapon, though in very different ways. Where Edison leaned into fear, Tesla leaned into wonder. Both left lasting impressions on the crowds who witnessed their shows, and both shaped the future of electricity, not only through engineering but through spectacle. Thomas Edison, ever the shrewd businessman, understood that the danger of alternating current could be dramatized. From the moment Tesla's system began to gain traction, Edison embarked on a campaign to convince the public that AC was deadly, far too dangerous for use in homes and cities. He believed, or at least insisted, that direct current was safer. In his mind, if people came to associate alternating current with death, they would resist its adoption. And so, demonstrations were arranged, not in laboratories but in front of crowds, where AC would be used to kill animals. Dogs, cats, and even larger creatures were tied to metal plates, and when the switch was thrown, the current coursed through them, convulsing their bodies and ending their lives in seconds. The displays horrified many, but they also made headlines. Newspapers carried sensational stories about the lethal power of AC, reinforcing Edison's message. The most infamous example of this campaign came years later, when an elephant named Topsy was publicly electrocuted in 1903 at Coney Island. Though Edison himself did not organize the event, his earlier demonstrations had laid the groundwork for such gruesome spectacles. The image of the great animal collapsing under the force of alternating current became seared into public memory. For Edison's side, it was a proof of danger. For critics, it was proof of cruelty. Either way, the demonstration showed just how far the war had extended into the realm of public perception. Tesla, by contrast, sought to win hearts and minds, not through fear, but through awe. Where Edison emphasized danger, Tesla emphasized possibility. In his lectures and exhibitions, he became a kind of magician of science, dazzling audiences with displays that seemed like conjuring tricks. He would pass alternating current through his own body, lighting lamps he held in his hands, showing that a sea need not always be fatal. He built enormous coils that emitted brilliant arcs of blue-white lightning, filling halls with the crackle and roar of electricity leaping through the air. Spectators gasped as bulbs glowed without wires, powered only by the invisible waves Tesla created. For many, it was the first glimpse of wireless power, an idea that seemed impossible, yet appeared before their eyes. Tesla's demonstrations carried a theatrical quality. He stood tall and elegant, often dressed immaculately, his dark eyes fixed on the machines he had built. He spoke with a soft accent, his words carrying the authority of a man who believed deeply in what he showed. To watch Tesla work was to be transported into a vision of the future. Electricity no longer seemed a shadowy, dangerous force, but a beautiful, controllable energy that could light the world, drive machines, and perhaps one day even be transmitted through the air to power everything without wires. His lectures became famous, drawing scientists, journalists, and curious members of the public alike. While Edison's spectacles played on fear, Tesla's invited wonder, and each shaped the public debate in its own way. The fascination with demonstrations was not confined to these two figures alone. The late 19th century was an age of exhibitions, world's fairs, and public lectures where science and technology were put on display. Electricity was a favorite subject, its strange, invisible qualities lending themselves to theatrical presentation. Sparks leaping between metal balls, coils buzzing with energy, motors spinning as if by magic. All of these captivated audiences hungry for marvels. The exhibitions were more than entertainment. They were a way of educating the public, of easing fears, of inspiring confidence, or, in Edison's case, of sowing doubt. In this sense, danger and demonstration went hand in hand, each shaping the image of electricity in the minds of ordinary people. Yet behind the drama lay genuine risk. Electricity was not fully understood, and the devices used in demonstrations were often crude by modern standards. Shocks could be fatal. Equipment could fail and fires could start. The very act of showing electricity to the public carried a sense of danger that lent excitement, but also real peril. Tesla himself endured painful shocks and accidents, though he often downplayed them. Edison's animal electrocutions, meanwhile, horrified animal rights advocates and damaged his reputation with those who saw them as barbaric. But for a society just beginning to grasp what electricity meant, the spectacle was part of the process of normalization. To accept electricity, people needed to see it, to hear it, to feel its presence in a controlled way. Demonstration was not optional. It was essential. The contrast between Edison and Tesla's approaches reflected their personalities. Edison was pragmatic, focused on winning by any means necessary, unafraid of harsh tactics if they served his business interests. Tesla was idealistic, focused on beauty, imagination, and the possibilities of science. Edison sought to control perception through fear. Tesla sought to inspire belief through wonder. In the end, Tesla's approach proved more persuasive in the long run. The dazzling displays of a sea's power at the World's Columbian Exposition. In 1893, when Tesla's system lit the fairgrounds with brilliance, captivated millions. A sight of entire boulevards glowing, fountains lit with colored lights, and machines running silently on alternating current overwhelmed the memory of Edison's warnings. The public chose wonder over fear. Still, the memory of danger lingered. The early years of electrification were marked by accidents, fires, and shocks. Wires strung haphazardly across cities sometimes sparked and fell, injuring pedestrians. Newspapers reported deaths from accidental contact with live lines. The fear Edison had stoked was not entirely unfounded, though it was exaggerated. Electricity was powerful, and like any powerful tool, it required respect, regulation, and care. Over time, safety measures improved, standards were established, and the dangers diminished. But the tension between promise and peril, between wonder and fear, remained part of electricity's story. The demonstrations of the late 19th century reveal something fundamental about how societies adopt new technologies. People do not embrace innovation simply because it works. They embrace it because they see it, because they feel it, because they are persuaded that it belongs in their lives. Edison's gruesome spectacles and Tesla's theatrical marvels both served this function, each in their own way. They turned an invisible force into a visible reality, shaping how people thought about electricity. Looking back, it is easy to criticize Edison's cruelty or to romanticize Tesla's showmanship, but both were products of their time, men working. In an age when electricity was still a mystery to most, the danger was real, the wonder was real, and the line between them was thin. The war of currents was not won only in patents and contracts. It was won in the hearts and minds of the public, who had to be convinced that electricity was not a menace but a miracle. Demonstrations, for all their spectacle, were the battleground on which that decision was made. In the end, the world chose. Tesla's vision, alternating current, became the standard, and the glowing lights of cities proved far more persuasive than Edison's grim exhibitions. But the memory of those early demonstrations lingers, a reminder of how fragile public trust can be, how easily it can be swayed by fear or wonder, and how much the acceptance of new ideas depends not only on science but on showmanship. The story of electricity is not just the story of wires and machines. It is the story of human imagination, of danger turned into marvel, of demonstrations that revealed a future brighter than anyone had ever dreamed. By the closing years of the 19th century, the battle between direct current and alternating current had raged for more than a decade. Accusations had been hurled, demonstrations staged, lawsuits filed, and fortunes risked. Edison had fought fiercely to defend his system of direct current, warning of the dangers of alternating current and seeking to shape public opinion through fear. Tesla, with the support of George Westinghouse, had countered with dazzling demonstrations and visionary promises, showing that alternating current could carry energy farther, more efficiently, and more powerfully than anything Edison's system could achieve. The public had seen electricity kill animals in grim spectacles and had seen it light entire halls with shimmering brilliance. But when the shouting quieted, when the demonstrations ended, when the contracts were signed and the machinery built, one current emerged as the clear victor. It was not won by words alone, but by physics, by practicality, by the silent, unstoppable flow of energy over miles of wire. Alternating current triumphed, not with one dramatic moment, but with countless small victories that spread invisibly through cities, towns, and homes, until its dominance was no longer a question, but a fact of life. The first great symbol of this triumph came in 1893, when the World's Columbian Exposition opened in Chicago. The fair was intended to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Columbus's voyage to the New World, but it became just as famous for celebrating the modern age. Visitors poured through its gates, marveling at its grand white buildings and enormous exhibition halls. But what captured their imagination most was the light. Westinghouse, using Tesla's alternating current system, had won the contract to illuminate the fairgrounds. When night fell and thousands of incandescent lamps flickered on, the effect was breathtaking. For miles, the fair glowed with an intensity never before seen, entire boulevards shining as if daylight had been captured and poured into the streets. Colored lights danced on fountains, machinery hummed silently, and electricity seemed less like a threat and more like a miracle. More than 27 million people attended the exposition, and for many, it was their first encounter with alternating current. They left convinced that the future had arrived, and that future was a sea. The victory was not just symbolic. Cities across the United States began signing contracts for alternating current systems, eager to extend the same glow into their streets and homes. Factories that once relied on steam engines could now run directly on electricity delivered by AC motors, increasing efficiency and reducing costs. Homes could be lit more safely than with gas, without the risk of explosion or the suffocating smoke of open flames. Businesses extended their hours into the night. Theaters dazzled audiences with brilliant illumination, and city streets became safer under electric lamps. Each new installation of alternating current made the case more powerfully than words ever could. The true test of a sea's potential, however, lay at Niagara Falls. For centuries, the thunderous cascade of water had been admired as one of the world's great natural wonders. Poets wrote about its majesty, travelers described its roar, and engineers dreamed of harnessing its power. The falls represented raw energy on a scale unimaginable, and the question was whether that energy could be captured and transmitted to where it was needed. In the late 1880s, a fierce competition erupted to determine who would build the power plant at Niagara. Edison pushed for direct current, insisting it was safer and more reliable. But Tesla and Westinghouse argued for alternating current, promising that a sea could carry the fall's power miles away to serve entire cities. The decision was momentous, and when the contract was awarded to Westinghouse, it signaled a turning point. Construction of the plant was an immense undertaking, requiring engineers to build turbines and generators capable of handling the force of the rushing water. Tesla's designs for AC motors and systems provided the blueprint. When the plant began operation in 1896, electricity flowed from the falls to Buffalo, New York, 20 miles away. It was the first long-distance transmission of power on such a scale, and it worked flawlessly. Lamps lit, machines turned, and the city glowed with energy carried invisibly across the countryside. What had once seemed impossible had become real. Niagara Falls had been tamed, and alternating current had proven beyond doubt that it was the future. The triumph of a sea was silent in the most literal sense. Unlike the hissing of gas lamps or the rumble of steam engines, electricity worked quietly. Wires carried it unseen into homes and factories. Lamps glowed steadily without flicker, and motors ran with smooth precision. To those who used it, a sea seemed almost effortless, a constant presence that asked for nothing and delivered everything. The transition happened gradually, neighborhood by neighborhood, city by city, but with each passing year, direct current receded and alternating current spread. By the early 20th century, the war was effectively over. AC had won. For Edison, the loss was a blow to his pride and his business empire. He had staked his reputation on direct current and fought with every weapon at his disposal. Yet the practical realities were undeniable. DC required power stations on nearly every block, while AC could deliver electricity across miles. Edison's company eventually adapted, though grudgingly, and moved toward AC systems. For Tesla, the victory was vindication. He had dreamed of a world powered by alternating current, and now that dream was real. But the triumph was bittersweet. Much of the financial reward went to Westinghouse, who had bought Tesla's patents, while Tesla himself remained restless, already consumed by new visions that reached beyond the practical success of AC. The public, meanwhile, accepted the new current without much thought. To them, electricity was electricity. They cared little whether it flowed directly or alternated. What mattered was that their homes were lit, their streets were safe, and their factories productive. Yet beneath their daily lives lay Tesla's vision, the invisible currents humming through wires, the silent triumph of a system that made modern life possible. It is worth pausing to reflect on the scale of the transformation. In the span of a single generation, humanity had moved from candles and oil lamps to entire cities ablaze with light at the flick of a switch. Communication, industry, entertainment, and domestic life were all reshaped by the spread of electricity, and at the heart of it was the victory of alternating current, a victory not of showmanship or fear, but of efficiency, scalability, and vision. The demonstrations had ended, the debates had quieted, and what remained was the steady glow of a sea. Lamps across the world. Tesla once described electricity as a force that filled the universe, waiting to be tapped. With the triumph of alternating current, that vision became reality. Power plants rose beside rivers, dams, and coal fields, feeding energy into grids that grew ever larger. Wires stretched across landscapes, bringing light to towns that had once known only darkness after sunset. The silent hum of electricity became the background of modern life. Few noticed it, and fewer still understood it, but all depended on it. The triumph was so complete, so total, that in time people forgot there had ever been a war at all. The legacy of this victory endures. To this day, alternating current remains the standard for power transmission worldwide. The devices we use, the cities we inhabit, The industries that drive economies all rest on the foundation laid by Tesla's vision and Westinghouse's determination. Edison's direct current survives only in specialized applications, a relic of an earlier era. The war that once consumed headlines and divided scientists has long since ended, but its outcome still shapes every moment of modern life. The silent triumph of a sea reminds us that revolutions do not always announce themselves with noise. Sometimes they arrive quietly, invisibly in the background of daily life, until one day the world has changed, and we scarcely remember how it was before. In the glow of electric lamps, in the hum of motors, in the steady current flowing through the walls of every home, Tesla's vision continues to live, silent yet enduring, the unseen heartbeat of the modern world. When Alexander Graham Bell first spoke the words, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you," into his crude prototype telephone in 1876, it was a marvel that few could fully grasp. The human voice transformed into vibrations carried by an electric current and then heard again at a distance. This was a concept so novel, so foreign that even those who witnessed it struggled to imagine its future. Some dismissed the invention as little more than a curiosity, a parlor trick that might entertain but never endure. Others recognized its promise but wondered how it could ever be scaled beyond a few experimental devices. Yet Bell was convinced from the beginning that the telephone was not just an invention, but a revolution in waiting. And in the years that followed, what began as a fragile device in a workshop became a vast network that stretched across towns, cities, and eventually nations, binding people together in ways they had never known. At first, progress was slow. The early telephone instruments were awkward, sensitive to interference, and limited in range. The wires carrying the signals crackled with static, and the voices transmitted through them sounded faint and ghostly. Conversations were short and often filled with repetition. What? Say that again, as people adjusted to the strange experience of hearing a distant voice as if it were in the room. Even so, those first users sensed something profound. Unlike the telegraph, which reduced communication to dots and dashes, the telephone carried tone, emotion, and nuance. A laugh, a sigh, a tremor of worry in the voice, all could be conveyed instantly, bridging distance in a way no written message ever could. It was this intimacy that gave the telephone its unique power. Bell himself worked tirelessly not only on the technology, but also on persuading others of its value. He demonstrated his invention before audiences of scientists, businessmen, and politicians. Reactions were mixed. Some were astonished, crowding around to listen. Others scoffed that it would never be practical on a large scale. The telegraph was already entrenched, a global network that carried messages across continents and oceans. Why replace it with a fragile device that required people to speak directly, without the aid of trained operators to translate code? Yet, Bell persisted, buoyed by his belief in the human voice as the ultimate medium of connection. In 1877, only a year after that first successful experiment, the Bell Telephone Company was founded. It began modestly with a few hundred instruments in use, but it was the seed of something immense. Wires were strung between offices and homes, connecting businesses that quickly realized the advantage of instant conversation. Merchants could place orders without sending messengers. Doctors could be summoned without delay. and newspapers could gather reports more quickly than ever. What had once taken hours or days could now be accomplished in minutes. Slowly, the utility of the telephone became undeniable. The growth of Bell's network was not without fierce opposition. The Western Union Telegraph Company, which dominated communication in the 19th century, saw the telephone as a direct threat. They initially dismissed it as a toy, but as it spread, they scrambled to develop their own version. Lawsuits erupted, patents were contested, and for years the courts battled over who owned the rights to this new technology. Bell and his backers defended their claims vigorously, and though the legal fights drained energy and resources, they ultimately secured Bell's place as the true inventor. It was a victory not only for him, but for the future of the telephone, which might otherwise have been smothered by corporate resistance. Once established, the network expanded rapidly. Cities saw wires crisscrossing their streets, climbing up poles and stretching across rooftops. Early telephone exchanges were set up, where operators, often women, prized for their patience and clear speech sat before switchboards, manually connecting calls by plugging and unplugging wires to place a call. One lifted the receiver and spoke to the operator, who would then link the line to the desired number. These operators became unseen voices of connection, guiding conversations across towns and eventually across states. Their work was tedious, often stressful, yet essential to the growth of the network. For many people, the operator was as much a part of the telephone as the device itself. In homes, the telephone was at first a luxury. Wealthier families could afford the installation fees and monthly charges, while ordinary households relied on letters and face-to-face visits. But as costs decreased and the network expanded, telephones became more common. A mother could now call a neighbor instead of walking across town. A business owner could settle accounts without leaving his office, and relatives could hear each other's voices even when miles apart. Slowly, the telephone began to weave itself into the daily rhythm of life, shrinking distance and changing habits. The network's growth was not only technical, but cultural. At first, people were uncertain how to behave on the telephone. There were debates about the proper way to answer. Bell himself suggested "ahoy," while others preferred "are you there?" Eventually, "hello" became the standard, a word that before the telephone was rarely used as a greeting. Etiquette guides were published, advising callers on how to speak politely, how long to occupy a line, and how to avoid offending others. The telephone was more than a machine. It was a new social practice, one that required learning and adaptation. For Bell, the expansion of his network was both vindication and transformation. He had begun as a teacher of the deaf, fascinated by sound and speech, motivated by the desire to help people like his mother and his students. Now his invention was reshaping the world. Yet he did not rest on this achievement. His restless mind turned to other pursuits, experiments in flight and sound recording in education. The telephone network, however, grew beyond him, guided by businessmen, engineers, and thousands of workers who strung the wires, manned the switchboards, and installed the instruments. What had begun in his workshop became a living system, expanding day by day. By the dawn of the 20th century, the reach of Bell's growing network was astonishing. Telephone lines connected cities, stretching across mountains and plains. Long-distance calling became possible, though still costly, allowing voices to travel hundreds of miles. Eventually, undersea cables would carry voices across oceans, though that triumph came later. For now, the simple fact that one could speak to another person in a different city within seconds was nothing short of miraculous. Business was transformed, politics accelerated, and personal life reshaped. The world felt smaller, more intimate, bound together by wires humming with conversation. The impact on society was profound. Farmers in rural areas began to organize their own telephone cooperatives, stringing lines between farms so neighbors could keep in touch. Urban families grew accustomed to the presence of a phone in the hallway, a device that rang suddenly, unexpectedly, demanding attention. New industries emerged, from manufacturing instruments to training operators. Jobs were created, fortunes made, and the very rhythm of daily life shifted. The pause of waiting for a letter gave way to the immediacy of a call. News traveled faster, decisions were made more quickly, and emergencies could be addressed with unprecedented speed. It is easy, looking back, to underestimate the scale of the change. In our own time, when voices and images cross the globe instantly through invisible signals, the telephone seems simple, even quaint. But in Bell's age, it was nothing less than astonishing. It bridged the gap between people in ways never imagined before. To hear the voice of a loved one far away was to collapse distance itself, to feel presence where before there was only absence. It was not just communication. It was intimacy preserved across miles. The growing network was not without critics. Some worried that constant communication would erode privacy, that gossip would spread too quickly, that people would become dependent on machines instead of personal visits. Others feared the tangle of wires that filled cities, dark webs of cable stretching between poles, cluttering skylines, and occasionally sparking fires. Yet these concerns were outweighed by the benefits, and the expansion continued relentlessly. The telephone had moved from novelty to necessity, from experiment to infrastructure. By the time Bell grew older, the network that bore his name had already outgrown him. He lived long enough to see millions of telephones in use, long enough to know that his invention had reshaped human life in ways he had only dimly foreseen. But even he, with all his imagination, could not have predicted the full extent of its reach. What began as a scratchy sentence in a workshop became a global web of voices carrying laughter, arguments, love, and grief across the world. Bell's growing network was not just a technical system. It was the nervous system of modern civilization, binding humanity together in a way that candles, gas lamps, and letters never could. The telephone network did not announce its triumph with fireworks or public demonstrations. Its victory came quietly, steadily, line by line, call by call, until life without it was unthinkable. That is perhaps the truest measure of its success. It became invisible, taken for granted, a constant presence humming in the background of daily life. And in that invisibility lay its greatest triumph, the creation of a connected world, a world in which silence was no longer an inevitability, and distance no longer an unbridgeable gulf. By the final years of the 19th century, electricity had moved from the realm of experiment and exhibition into the fabric of daily life. What had once been demonstrated in lecture halls and world fairs was now seeping quietly into homes, factories, and streets, transforming the rhythm of existence in ways so profound that within a single generation, people could scarcely remember what life had been like without it. The inventions of Edison, Tesla, and Bell were no longer curiosities. They were becoming necessities. Lamps glowed in kitchens and parlors, machines hummed in factories long after sunset, and telephones rang with voices from across town. Electricity was not only a technological force, but a social one, reshaping how people lived, worked, and imagined their futures. In the home, the most immediate and visible change was light. The glow of an incandescent lamp, steady and smoke-free, was a revelation to households accustomed to candles and gas. Where once families had gathered around a single flame, now entire rooms could be illuminated evenly, making evening hours productive in ways previously unthinkable. Children could read and study without straining their eyes. Adults could sew, write, or simply enjoy conversation without the smell of tallow or kerosene. The risk of house fires from open flames diminished, and the quality of air improved without constant smoke. In wealthier homes, electric chandeliers became symbols of modern sophistication, while even modest families aspired to the simple comfort of a lamp that lit with the flick of a switch. The psychological impact was immense. Night no longer marked the end of activity. Darkness had been tamed. Electricity in the home soon extended beyond lighting. Inventors and manufacturers began adapting appliances to this new power source, and though adoption was slow at first, the possibilities seemed limitless. Early electric irons relieved the tedium of heating heavy metal plates over a fire. Electric fans brought relief in summer, moving air through stifling rooms. Refrigerators, though initially rare and expensive, hinted at a future where food could be preserved more safely, replacing the dependence on ice deliveries. Each new device chipped away at the labor and discomfort that had defined household work for centuries. The promise was clear. Electricity could bring convenience, efficiency, and even leisure into everyday domestic life. The transformation was just as dramatic in the workplace. Factories, which had long depended on daylight or gaslight, could now operate with electric lamps, extending shifts into the night and increasing productivity. Electric motors replaced steam engines, eliminating the need for massive, noisy machinery, powered by belts and shafts that ran across factory ceilings. Instead, smaller, safer, and more efficient motors could be installed at individual machines, reducing accidents and allowing greater flexibility in layout. Production lines became faster, quieter, and more efficient. Textile mills, printing presses, and machine shops all adopted electric power, and the hum of motors soon replaced the hiss of steam. The Industrial Revolution, already underway, accelerated with this new source of energy, reshaping economies and labor. For office workers, electricity brought its own changes. Typewriters clicked under steady electric lights, allowing clerks to work longer hours with greater accuracy. Elevators, powered by electric motors, made tall buildings practical, reshaping city skylines and giving rise to the modern office tower. Fans circulated air, lights brightened rooms, and telephones rang with calls that connected businesses across neighborhoods and cities. Commerce, once slowed by distance and time, now moved with unprecedented speed. Orders placed in the morning could be fulfilled by evening, decisions could be made in minutes, and markets expanded as communication and production kept pace with one another. Public life was transformed as well. Streets lit by electric lamps became safer, bustling with activity long after dusk. Shops extended their hours, theaters attracted larger audiences, and cities pulsed with nightlife in ways impossible before. The glow of electric light became a marker of modernity, a sign that a town or city had entered the new age. In rural areas where electrification came more slowly, the contrast was stark. Visitors from the countryside marveled at the brilliance of urban streets, describing them as seas of light that never dimmed. For those who lived with candles and oil lamps, the promise of electricity became a powerful symbol of progress, something to aspire to, even if it would take decades to arrive. The adoption of electricity also reshaped social habits. Families gathered around electric lamps in parlors, reading newspapers, or listening to phonographs powered by the same invisible force. Dinner parties glowed more brightly, with lights accentuating fine tableware and decorations. Domestic chores grew slightly easier, though still far from effortless, as early appliances appeared. At the same time, the telephone began to alter communication within and between households. Neighbors could be reached with a quick call instead of a long walk, and family members working in distant offices could check in without waiting for the post. The boundaries of home and work blurred as voices carried instantly across wires, weaving households into the wider network of society. The presence of electricity, however, was not uniform. In the 1890s and early 1900s, it was still primarily the domain of the urban middle and upper classes. The cost of wiring a house and paying for service was beyond the reach of many, and in rural areas infrastructure lagged far behind. For farmers and laborers, life continued much as it had for centuries, with lamps filled each evening, fires tended daily, and communication carried by mail or word of mouth. The uneven spread of electricity created a visible divide between those who lived in the glow of modernity and those who remained in the shadows of tradition. Yet the direction of change was clear, and even in remote regions the promise of electricity loomed on the horizon. Culturally, electricity became a metaphor, as much as a utility. Writers and poets spoke of being electrified by excitement, borrowing the language of science to describe emotion. Advertisements promised a brighter, cleaner, easier future, powered by wires hidden in walls. The symbolism of light defeating darkness carried powerful resonance, especially in a century that had already witnessed so much rapid change. Electricity was not only altering how people lived, it was altering how they imagined life could be. Of course, the transition was not without anxiety. Stories of accidental electrocutions circulated in newspapers, reminding readers that this new force was powerful and potentially dangerous. The tangle of wires strung across city streets often caused fires or fell to the ground in storms, leading to debates about regulation and safety. Critics worried that constant artificial light would harm health or disrupt natural rhythms. Others feared that technology was advancing too quickly, leaving behind traditions and disrupting social norms. Yet these concerns, though real, were outweighed by the undeniable benefits. Each year brought improvements in safety, reliability, and cost, and each year electricity spread further into the fabric of life. by the early 20th century, electricity had become an inseparable part of modern existence in many parts of the world. Homes glowed at night, factories churned around the clock, offices buzzed with activity, and cities shone like beacons visible from miles away. The dream of endless light and instant power had moved from fantasy to routine. What had once been the marvel of a fairground exhibition was now the flick of a switch in an ordinary home. The extraordinary had become ordinary, and in that ordinariness lay the true triumph of electricity. Looking back, it is astonishing how quickly life changed. A child born in the 1870s might have grown up reading by candlelight, working in a factory, powered by steam, and writing letters that took days to arrive. That same child, by adulthood in the early 1900s, could come home to an electrically lit house, take an elevator to an office in a tall building, and speak by telephone to someone in another city. The transformation was so rapid that within a single lifetime the boundaries of possibility had shifted. Electricity had redefined what it meant to live, to work, and to connect. This chapter in the story of electricity is not about spectacular battles or rivalries, but about the quiet, steady integration of a new force into daily life. It is about the glow of a lamp in a kitchen, the hum of a motor in a factory, the ring of a telephone in an office. It is about ordinary people discovering that the limits they once accepted, the darkness of night, the slowness of communication, the grind of manual labor, were no longer absolute. Electricity did not erase hardship, but it softened its edges and opened doors to new possibilities. Its greatest triumph was not in the laboratories of inventors or the contracts of businessmen, but in the lives of millions of people whose world grew brighter, safer, and more connected because of it. The 19th century was an age of spectacle. Nations displayed their pride and progress through great expositions, where the wonders of industry, art, and science were gathered into sprawling pavilions for the world to admire. These world's fairs were more than entertainment. They were declarations of power, symbols of modernity, and promises of futures still unfolding. And of all the marvels exhibited in those grand halls and boulevards, none captured the imagination more completely than electricity. It was invisible, mysterious, and yet capable of transforming darkness into day, silence into sound, and distance into intimacy. At the fairs, electricity was not hidden in wires behind walls. It was celebrated, dramatized, and displayed as the very essence of progress. For millions of visitors who flocked to these exhibitions, the sight of glowing bulbs, humming motors, and sparkling fountains was their first encounter with the electric age. These events became stages upon which the revolution of Edison, Tesla, and Bell was performed for the entire world to see. The World's Columbian Exposition of 1893 in Chicago is remembered as perhaps the greatest of these spectacles. The fair was meant to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Columbus's voyage, but it became even more famous as the moment when electricity, and especially alternating current, stepped into the spotlight. The fairgrounds stretched over 600 acres, a gleaming city of white buildings, lagoons, and grand avenues that would later be called the White City. When night fell, the White City lived up to its name. More than 100,000 incandescent lamps, powered by Westinghouse generators using Tesla's alternating current system, illuminated the grounds with a brilliance never before seen. Visitors who had traveled by train or carriage from rural towns where nights were still lit only by lanterns were overwhelmed by the sight. Streets glowed, domes shimmered, and fountains sprayed colored lights into the evening air. To walk. The fair at night was to walk through a dream, a vision of a future in which darkness no longer held sway over human life. The Columbian Exposition did more than dazzle. It proved to the world that alternating current was practical, safe, and capable of powering entire cities. For months, more than 20 million people wandered through its illuminated halls, listening to phonographs, speaking through telephones, and marveling at motors that ran silently without steam. They saw Tesla himself demonstrate his coils, producing arcs of lightning that crackled through the air, lighting bulbs held in his hands. They watched the machinery hall, filled with enormous dynamos turning water into light and motion. It was a symphony of power, and it silenced much of the fear that Edison had stirred with his campaigns. The fair made clear that the electric future was not merely possible, but inevitable. Yet the Columbian Exposition was not the first nor the last of these grand demonstrations. Earlier fairs had already hinted at electricity's potential. At the Paris Exposition of 1878, the newly perfected incandescent lamp astonished crowds. Its steady glow, unlike anything they had seen. The streets of Paris, already called the City of Light for its gas lamps, now truly earned the name as electric arcs lit boulevards and monuments. The Eiffel Tower, constructed for the Paris Exposition of 1889, became a beacon of illumination, its iron lattice shimmering with thousands of lights. Visitors looked up at the tower and saw not only an engineering triumph, but a symbol of how electricity could transform even the night sky into a canvas of modernity. World's fairs became competitions in brilliance as nations sought to outshine one another not only with architecture and art, but with light itself. Electricity was the new weapon of prestige. In Philadelphia, in London, in Paris, in St. Louis, expositions displayed halls ablaze with lamps, engines running on currents, and communication devices transmitting voices and messages. Each fair left its visitors carrying stories back to their towns and villages of the wonders they had witnessed, spreading both fascination and desire. The fairs acted as gateways, introducing electricity to the public, not through theory or technical detail, but through experience. To see a building glow, brighter than day in the middle of the night, was to feel the promise of a new world. The psychological effect was immense. People who had lived their whole lives by the rhythm of sunrise and sunset suddenly glimpsed a life where night could be conquered, where cities could remain awake, alive, and safe after dark. Electricity became linked in the popular imagination with progress itself. To live in an electrified city was to be modern. To remain in candlelit towns was to be left behind. The fairs spread this message more effectively than any lecture or book could have done. They transformed electricity from an abstract concept into a lived experience, one that millions carried back with them as memory and expectation. For inventors like Tesla, these fairs were more than exhibitions. They were vindication, standing before crowds, surrounded by machines that embodied his theories. Tesla could demonstrate that alternating current was not dangerous chaos, but ordered power, controllable and beautiful. For Edison, the fairs were more complex. Though his incandescent lamps were often displayed, the growing dominance of a sea revealed the limits of his direct current system. Still, the fairs ensured that his name remained linked to the magic of electric light. For Bell, the exhibitions of telephones showed the public that communication itself had changed. In demonstration booths, people spoke into receivers and heard distant voices reply, their eyes widening with amazement. The fairs were theaters in which all three men, in different ways, saw their visions presented to the world. The legacy of these World's Fairs endured long after their gates closed. The White City in Chicago was dismantled. The Eiffel Tower remained as a monument, and countless exhibition halls were repurposed or destroyed. But the memory of their lights lived on in the minds of millions. The fairs accelerated demand for electrification, pushing cities and companies to adopt systems that mirrored what had been seen in those glowing boulevards. They also shaped the cultural meaning of electricity. It was not simply a tool, but a symbol of human mastery over nature, of progress marching inexorably forward. What is striking is how quickly the extraordinary became ordinary. Visitors to the Chicago Fair returned home, speaking in awe of the thousands of lights, the shimmering fountains, the buzzing machinery. Yet within a generation, such sights became commonplace. City streets across the world glowed nightly. Fountains lit with colored lamps became municipal features, and buildings were illuminated not just for exhibitions but for everyday use. The fairs had offered a glimpse of the future, and that future had arrived. World's Fairs of Light remind us that technology spreads not only through necessity but through wonder. People adopt what they desire, what they dream of, as much as what they need. The sight of a city glowing brighter than day did more to persuade the public than any scientific argument could. It allowed people to imagine themselves living in such brilliance, and once imagined, it became inevitable. By the early 20th century, electricity had become so deeply woven into life that its marvel faded into routine. Yet the memory of those first encounters at World's Fairs remained a cultural touchstone. They were the moments when humanity saw with collective eyes the shape of its own future. They were moments of transition when candles and gaslights gave way to bulbs and wires, when silence gave way to voices across lines, when the natural rhythm of day and night yielded to human control. In the glow of those fairs, the electric age announced itself, not quietly, but with blazing certainty. And so, as the crowds dispersed, as the lights dimmed, and as the fairgrounds returned to silence, the world itself did not return to the old darkness. It carried the memory of light, and with it, the determination to make that light permanent. The fairs ended, but the illumination they revealed continued, spreading outward until it filled homes, streets, and entire nations. The spectacle of electricity, first shown as a marvel, became the foundation of modern life. When we speak of the electric revolution, we often describe inventions, the light bulb, the alternating current motor, the telephone, as though they appeared from the ether, complete and inevitable. But inventions are not born in isolation. They are the work of human minds, shaped by temperaments, quirks, ambitions, and flaws. Behind every wire and glowing lamp, behind every telephone call and humming generator, stood three men whose personalities defined not only their inventions, but the very character of the age. Thomas Edison, Nikola Tesla, and Alexander Graham Bell. To understand how their creations came to be, one must also understand who they were, their obsessions, their strengths, their eccentricities, and their struggles. For the electric revolution was not just about science. It was about human character expressed through invention. Thomas Edison was perhaps the most famous of the three during his own lifetime, celebrated as the Wizard of Menlo Park. His genius lay not in single flashes of inspiration, but in persistence. Edison believed invention was less about sudden brilliance and more about hard work, famously remarking that genius was 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. His laboratories functioned almost like factories of ideas, staffed by teams of assistants who carried out thousands of experiments under his direction. He was tireless, often working late into the night, sleeping only briefly in chairs or on benches, then rising to continue. He thrived on publicity, inviting reporters to see his latest marvels, cultivating an image of himself as the lone wizard, even as dozens of collaborators worked alongside him. Edison's personality was practical, combative, and relentlessly focused on results. He could be charming, but also ruthless, unwilling to yield to rivals, fiercely protective of his patents, and unafraid of controversy. His deafness, which isolated him from ordinary conversation, perhaps added to his inward focus and determination. To Edison, the world was a puzzle to be solved through effort, and failure was simply another step toward success. If Edison was the pragmatist, Tesla was the visionary, a man who seemed to inhabit a world half in reality and half in imagination. Tall, slender, and elegant, he carried an aura of otherworldliness that fascinated those who met him. Tesla experienced vivid visions from childhood images that appeared before his eyes with startling clarity, sometimes overwhelming him, sometimes guiding him. He claimed he could design entire machines in his mind, running them in thought until he was satisfied they would work, then building them exactly as imagined. This gift gave him a unique advantage, but also set him apart from others for his mind seemed to move too quickly, too far ahead for the world to keep up. He was meticulous in his habits, obsessive about cleanliness, prone to repeating actions in multiples of three, and often aloof in social settings. Yet when he stepped onto a stage to demonstrate his inventions, he became magnetic, captivating audiences with both his intellect and his showmanship. Tesla was generous with ideas, sometimes too generous, giving away patents or neglecting to secure financial backing, and as a result he often struggled with poverty, even as his visions reshaped the world. His personality was marked by brilliance, eccentricity, and tragedy, for he achieved so much but never found lasting recognition or wealth in his lifetime. Alexander Graham Bell, in contrast, was quieter, more scholarly, and deeply compassionate. His fascination with sound was rooted not only in science but in personal experience. With a mother who was deaf and a father who devoted his career to teaching the deaf, Bell grew up surrounded by the study of speech. He was gentle in manner, devoted to his students, and motivated by the desire to help others communicate. Where Edison thrived on publicity and Tesla pursued grand visions, Bell's work was grounded in human connection. He did not seek to electrify cities with light or power. He sought to carry voices across distance. His invention of the telephone was not only a technical triumph, but also an extension of his lifelong passion for bridging silence. Bell's personality was patient, thoughtful, and somewhat reserved, though he could be fiercely determined when pursuing an idea. Unlike Tesla, who often squandered opportunities, Bell managed to secure patents and build a lasting company, ensuring that his work endured. Yet even he sometimes seemed surprised by his own fame, for at heart he remained a teacher, more interested in understanding than in glory. The differences among these three men were stark. Edison embodied persistence, Tesla embodied vision, and Bell embodied compassion. Edison built empires of invention. Tesla dreamed of futures still far beyond his time. And Bell created tools that touched the intimacy of daily life. Together, their personalities created a dynamic tension that propelled the electric revolution forward. Without Edison's relentless drive, the light bulb might have remained a laboratory curiosity. Without Tesla's daring imagination, alternating current might never have become the lifeblood of modern power systems. Without Bell's devotion to sound, the telephone might never have carried human voices across wires. Each man's personality was inseparable from his achievement, yet their flaws were as influential as their strengths. Edison's competitiveness led him into bitter conflicts, sometimes blinding him to better solutions, as with his refusal to embrace alternating current. Tesla's eccentricities and poor business sense left him vulnerable to exploitation and neglect, even as his ideas proved indispensable. Bell's cautious nature sometimes slowed his pace, and his reluctance to embrace publicity meant that others often overshadowed his contributions in the popular imagination. These flaws remind us that genius is not perfection. It is often tangled with weakness, shaped by the same human limits that define us all. The public perception of each man was shaped by these personalities. Edison was celebrated as the great American inventor, a symbol of ingenuity and determination, his name printed in newspapers and textbooks. Tesla was seen as a brilliant but strange figure, admired by some, doubted by others, his reputation rising and falling with the tides of fortune. Bell was respected but not idolized, his image more that of a teacher and scientist than a celebrity. Over time, their legacies have shifted. Today, Tesla is often revered as a misunderstood genius. Edison is scrutinized for his ruthless tactics, as much as praised for his inventions, and Bell is remembered as the quiet pioneer of communication. Their personalities continue to color how we interpret their achievements. It is tempting to imagine what might have happened if their qualities could have been combined: the persistence of Edison, the vision of Tesla, the compassion of Bell. But history does not work that way. Each man was who he was, and it was precisely their unique personalities that gave rise to the inventions they created. The electric revolution was not the product of abstract genius alone. It was the product of human beings with all their strengths, weaknesses, passions, and quirks. When we look at the light glowing in a bulb, when we hear a voice carried across a line, when we see power coursing invisibly through wires, we are not only seeing technology, we are seeing the imprint of the men behind it. Edison's stubborn persistence, Tesla's visionary imagination, and Bell's compassionate scholarship live on in the systems we use every day. They remind us that progress is not only a matter of machines, but of the human spirit in all its complexity. The personalities behind the genius shaped not only their own fates, but the fate of the modern world. Without them, the electric age might have dawned later, or differently, or not at all. With them, it came as it did, a blend of practical invention, daring vision, and human connection. And though their lives were marked by triumph and struggle, alike together they left a legacy greater than any one man could have imagined. The story of the electric revolution is often told as a tale of triumph, of light conquering darkness, of invention bringing progress. Yet beneath the glowing lamps, the humming wires, and the ringing telephones lay another story, one of human cost. Thomas Edison, Nikola Tesla, and Alexander Graham Bell are remembered as heroes of innovation, but their journeys were marked by failure, disappointment, and sacrifice. They were not only inventors, but men who endured loss, frustration, and, in some cases, heartbreak. To understand the true shape of their legacy, we must look not only at what they achieved, but at what it cost them. Thomas Edison is remembered as the tireless inventor who seemed to succeed endlessly, yet his path was littered with failures. He experimented with thousands of materials before finding the right filament for the light bulb. He invested years and resources into projects that went nowhere, such as his attempts to develop a practical ore milling process, which consumed vast sums of money and left him nearly bankrupt. His invention of the phonograph was revolutionary, but many of his later phonograph designs struggled to compete with rivals. Even in his greatest successes, Edison's ambition drove him into battles that drained him. His refusal to yield to alternating current consumed years of his life, a fight that he ultimately lost. Beyond professional failure, Edison's personal life bore the weight of his relentless work. His first wife, Mary, died young, leaving him with 3 children. His second marriage brought stability, but Edison was often absent, immersed in his laboratory. His deafness isolated him from ordinary conversation, forcing him to rely on notes and lip reading, making even family life feel distant. Edison sacrificed rest, relationships, and often health for his work. His success came not from a charmed path, but from a willingness to endure failure after failure at immense personal cost. Tesla's story is even more deeply intertwined with struggle. Unlike Edison, who thrived as a businessman, Tesla was a poor manager of money and opportunity. His genius was unquestionable, but his eccentricities and idealism often left him vulnerable. He gave away patents worth fortunes, such as when he tore up his royalty agreement with Westinghouse to save the company from financial ruin. It was a gesture of generosity, but it left him without the wealth that might have secured his future. Tesla pursued visions that dazzled but sometimes outpaced practicality. His dream of wireless power consumed years of labor and funding, culminating in the construction of his enormous Wardenclyffe Tower on Long Island. The project promised to transmit energy across the world without wires, but investors grew impatient, skeptical of returns, and withdrew their support. The tower was never completed, and Tesla watched helplessly as his grandest vision crumbled. Tesla's struggles were not only financial, but personal. He was plagued by obsessive habits, unable to eat or work without ritual patterns. He avoided intimacy, never marrying, and often lived in isolation. His brilliance made him a celebrity in the 1890s, but as years passed and newer inventors captured attention, Tesla slipped into obscurity. He lived much of his later life in hotel rooms, feeding pigeons in city parks, speaking of inventions that remained in his mind but never came to fruition. Newspapers alternately mocked and admired him, portraying him as both a genius and a crank. He died in 1943, alone and in debt, a man whose vision had given the world its power, but who himself had little left. His life was a testament to the truth that genius alone is not enough. It must be paired with fortune, business, and recognition, and those were often denied him. Bell's struggles were of a different kind, quieter, but still profound. His invention of the telephone brought him fame and fortune, but it also brought endless legal battles. Competitors challenged his patents, claiming priority, and for years he fought in court to defend his rights. Though he ultimately prevailed, the constant disputes were wearying. Bell's personality was not that of a ruthless businessman. He was a teacher, a scientist, and a humanitarian. The world of corporate rivalry drained him, distracting him from his true interests. Beyond this, Bell's success sometimes felt like a betrayal of his original mission. He had devoted himself to helping the deaf, inspired by his mother's silence and his father's work. The telephone grew into a massive business empire, yet Bell himself confessed at times that he had not intended to invent a commercial device, but only to explore sound. His later years were spent returning to teaching, to research, to aviation experiments, searching for meaning beyond the telephone that had defined him. Sacrifice was not limited to the inventors themselves. Their families bore the weight of their obsessions. Edison's children grew up in the shadow of their father's fame, often competing for his attention. Tesla's family endured poverty and tragedy, including the loss of his beloved brother in childhood, a trauma Tesla never overcame. Bell's wife, Mabel, who had supported him through his experiments, also lived with the knowledge that her deafness had shaped his life's work. Behind every invention stood loved ones who gave their patience, their presence, and sometimes their happiness to support these men. The world, too, bore costs. Electrification was not free of danger. Early systems sparked fires, killed workers, and frightened the public. The war of currents, fought with propaganda and gruesome demonstrations, left scars on the reputation of electricity itself. Progress demanded risk, and that risk was often paid in human suffering. Workers strung wires across dangerous heights. Lab assistants endured shocks and burns, and entire communities debated whether the promise of electricity was worth its perils. Failure was not only an inventor's burden, it was society's as well. Yet it is precisely these failures, struggles, and sacrifices that give the triumphs meaning. Edison's endless experiments remind us that invention is not effortless genius, but persistence in the face of frustration. Tesla's poverty and isolation reveal the cruelty of a world that often fails to reward visionaries, yet also highlight the purity of his devotion to discovery for its own sake. Bell's weariness with lawsuits shows how even noble invention can be swallowed by the machinery of business, but also how personal conviction can endure beyond wealth and fame. Their sacrifices humanize them. They remind us that even those who shaped the modern world were fragile, fallible, and subject to loss. Today, when we flip a switch or make a call, we rarely think of these struggles. We see only the light, not the burned-out filaments that came before. We hear only the clear voice, not the failed experiments that preceded it. But behind every convenience lies the persistence of Edison, the vision of Tesla, and the compassion of Bell, forged through hardship. Their failures were as important as their successes, for they taught lessons, redirected paths, and demanded endurance. Their sacrifices were the price of progress, and though the world gained immeasurably, they themselves often paid dearly. The electric revolution shines brightly in memory, but it was born in shadows of struggle. It was not a smooth ascent, but a path of obstacles, disappointments, and costs. Edison, Tesla, and Bell each bore those costs in their own ways, and though their names endure in glory, their lives remind us that every triumph carries a price. The light that fills our world today is, in a sense, illuminated by their sacrifices. Electricity did not remain a marvel confined to laboratories, exhibition halls, or the glowing boulevards of a few great cities. Once the possibilities were revealed, once lamps had burned through the night at world's fairs, once telephones had carried voices from one house to another, once factories had replaced their steam engines with humming motors, the spread of power became not merely a technical possibility, but a global inevitability. The wires, dynamos, and towers that first appeared in Europe and North America grew outward across continents, crossing oceans and mountains, carrying with them not only light and sound, but the promise of modernity itself. To trace the global spread of electricity is to trace the way nations embraced change, sometimes eagerly, sometimes hesitantly, but always with the awareness that a new age had arrived at the dawn of the 20th century. The great centers of electrification were New York, London, Paris, and Berlin. These cities became symbols of the electric future, their skylines glittering with incandescent bulbs, their streets glowing after sundown. In New York, the success of Edison's Pearl Street station had already shown the feasibility of central power generation, while Tesla and Westinghouse's alternating current had proven capable of stretching far beyond city blocks, bringing power to entire regions. In London, electric streetcars and lights began to replace gas lamps, though the city's conservatism meant gas and electricity coexisted uneasily for decades. Paris dazzled the world with illuminated boulevards, earning its name as the City of Light anew, this time not through candles or gas, but through electricity. Berlin, meanwhile, rapidly industrialized with electric trams, trains, and factories, positioning Germany as one of the world's leaders in electrical engineering. These cities were the first nodes in a network that would in time cover the world. The spread of electricity was uneven, shaped by geography, politics, and economics. Wealthy nations and urban centers embraced it first, while rural regions lagged behind. In the United States, large cities glowed at night by the 1890s, but millions of farmers continued to work by lamplight well into the 1930s. The contrast between the electrified city and the dark countryside was striking. Similar divides appeared elsewhere. In Britain, London shone with electric light while remote villages clung to oil lamps. In Russia, St. Petersburg and Moscow built early power stations while vast stretches of rural land remained untouched. Electricity arrived first where profits could be made factories, wealthy neighborhoods, and urban streets before slowly filtering outward to ordinary homes and farms. In Asia, the spread of power carried both wonder and symbolism. Japan, eager to modernize after centuries of isolation, rapidly embraced electricity. Tokyo saw its first electric lamps in the 1880s, and within decades the city was lit with networks rivaling those of Europe. For Japan, electricity was not only practical, but political. It represented national progress, proof that the country could stand equal with Western powers. In India, electricity arrived under colonial rule. The first electric streetlights appeared in Calcutta in 1897, but progress was slow and often limited to urban centers serving colonial elites and industries. The contrast between electrified cities and vast rural darkness mirrored the inequalities of empire itself. Across China, electricity spread haltingly, introduced in treaty ports like Shanghai, where foreign companies established power stations. For many Chinese citizens, electricity was at first not a national utility, but a foreign commodity, controlled by outsiders. Africa, too, saw electricity arrive unevenly, concentrated in colonial capitals and industrial hubs. Cities like Cairo, Cape Town, and Lagos began to glow with electric light in the early decades of the 20th century, but rural villages continued to live by fire and lamp for generations. In South Africa, electricity was closely tied to mining, powering machinery deep underground. In North Africa, it illuminated colonial boulevards, but often skipped native neighborhoods entirely. Electricity became a symbol of progress, but also of exclusion, its glow often reinforcing the divisions between rulers and ruled. South America embraced electrification with enthusiasm in its growing cities. Buenos Aires, São Paulo, and Rio de Janeiro built networks of electric trams and streetlights, reshaping urban life. The wealth of coffee and trade fueled these developments, though again, rural regions lagged behind. In the Andes, hydroelectric plants began to emerge, harnessing rivers to bring power to expanding cities. In many cases, foreign companies built and operated these systems, embedding electricity into the global web of commerce and control. The Middle East experienced electricity first in its great cities of trade. Istanbul introduced electric trams and lights by the early 1900s, while Cairo's grand boulevards gleamed with lamps. In regions dependent on oil, electricity would later become entwined with resource wealth. But at first it arrived as a marker of urban modernization. Villages and deserts remained unchanged, while capitals displayed electric lights as signs of progress and prestige. The global spread of electricity was not only about wires and lamps, but also about the spread of ideas. Nations saw electrification as a statement of belonging to the modern world. To host a power station, to run electric trams, to light up boulevards at night, these were symbols of advancement, proof that a nation had entered the 20th century. Electricity became a measure of modernity, a dividing line between those who had embraced the future and those still tethered to the past. Governments invested heavily, sometimes for practical reasons, often for pride. Yet the spread was never purely smooth. Resistance emerged, both practical and cultural. Some communities feared electricity as dangerous or unnatural. Stories circulated of electrocutions, fires, and mysterious shocks. In rural areas, people asked why they should pay for wires and lamps when oil lamps sufficed. In some cultures, light after dark felt disruptive to traditional rhythms of life. Farmers rose before dawn and slept after sunset. What need had they of midnight lamps? Over time, these concerns faded as the benefits became clear, but the initial skepticism revealed that progress is never universally embraced. The technical challenges were immense. Building power stations required fuel, whether coal, oil, or water for hydroelectric dams. Stringing wires across mountains, deserts, and rivers demanded engineering feats. Standardizing systems required decisions about voltage, frequency, and design decisions that sometimes divided nations or regions. The war of currents may have ended in the United States with the triumph of alternating current, but globally different systems coexisted for decades, complicating international networks. Engineers and governments wrestled with these challenges, slowly weaving together the infrastructure of the electric world. By the 1920s and 1930s, the global map of electricity was striking. The great cities of Europe, North America, Japan, and parts of South America gleamed with light, their factories and homes humming with power. Vast regions of Africa, Asia, and rural America remained largely dark. The world was divided not only by wealth and empire, but by electricity itself. To live in an electrified city was to live in the modern age. To live without it was to remain in the 19th century. This divide shaped politics, economics, and aspirations as nations sought to bring electricity to their people and prove their progress. The Second World War further accelerated electrification as industries demanded massive power and wartime. Production pushed networks to expand. After the war, Reconstruction in Europe, the rise of the United States as a global power, and the push for modernization and decolonizing nations all contributed to the rapid spread of electricity. The wires reached into rural villages. Hydroelectric dams rose across rivers. Oil and coal powered vast grids, and entire populations entered the electric age. Looking back, the spread of electricity across the globe was not merely a technological change, but a reshaping of human life itself. It altered the rhythm of day and night, the nature of work, the possibilities of communication, and the meaning of modernity. It brought both wonder and inequality, progress and challenge. It was uneven, contested, and at times slow, but it was unstoppable. Today, when nearly every nation glows at night, when even remote villages run electric lights, it is difficult to imagine the world as it was before. Yet the memory of that spread remains in the history of nations, in the pride of cities that first gleamed with light, in the struggles of communities that waited decades, and in the determination of humanity to connect itself with power. The global spread of electricity was not just the triumph of technology, it was the triumph of human will to bring light where once there was darkness, to bring connection where once there was isolation, and to bind the world together in the glow of a shared modern age. When the first faint glow of Edison's incandescent lamp flickered to life in the late 19th century, few could have predicted how profoundly it would reshape the human story. What began as a laboratory experiment soon became a revolution that touched every corner of life. By the time the 20th century unfolded, the spread of electricity was no longer an experiment or a novelty. It was the foundation of modern civilization. The electric revolution was not just about wires and machines. It altered how people lived, how they worked, how they thought, and how they imagined the future. In truth, the world was forever changed, and the transformation was deeper than even Edison, Tesla, or Bell could have envisioned. Consider first the conquest of darkness. For millennia, night had imposed its unyielding rhythm upon humanity. The setting sun dictated when labor ceased and when rest began. Candles, oil lamps, and gas lights offered faint resistance, but their glow was dim, smoky, and costly. With the coming of electric light, night lost its dominion. Cities sparkled long after dusk. Shops stayed open. Factories ran through the midnight hours. Theaters glowed with brilliance. The boundaries between day and night blurred. A new rhythm of life emerged, one shaped not by the sun, but by the switch. Humanity had gained command over time itself. This conquest of darkness was not only practical, but symbolic. It gave people the sense that progress was limitless, that nature itself could be bent to human will. To walk through a city street ablaze with light was to feel part of a modern world, liberated from the ancient cycle of day and night. Electricity also redefined communication. When Bell's telephone carried voices across wires, distance itself began to shrink. Messages no longer needed to wait for couriers, ships, or trains. Voices leapt instantly from one home to another, from one continent to another. Later, with radio and telegraph networks powered by electricity, entire nations became linked in real time. News traveled at the speed of thought. Families stayed connected across oceans. Governments coordinated across vast empires. The isolation of distance began to erode, replaced by a web of connection. In this way, electricity was not only power but presence. It made the absent present, the far near, the silent audible. The world became smaller, not in geography but in experience. Industry, too, was transformed. Factories once driven by steam shifted to electric motors, which were cleaner, safer, and more versatile. Production lines became more efficient. Entire industries grew, from textiles to steel, from printing to automobiles, powered by reliable electric energy. Work itself changed. The labor of men and women was amplified by machines, and new jobs emerged to build, maintain, and operate. The electric systems. At the same time, electricity began to flow into homes, bringing appliances that reshaped domestic life. Refrigerators preserved food. Washing machines eased burdens. Radios brought music and news. The home became not only a shelter, but a site of modern convenience. Its routines transformed by the hum of motors and the glow of lamps. The electric revolution also altered imagination. Writers, artists, and thinkers looked at the glowing cities and saw visions of the future utopias of progress, dystopias of control, but always worlds made possible by electricity. It inspired dreams of machines that could fly, cities that never slept, communication across the stars. It gave humanity the confidence that invention could overcome any barrier. The 20th century, with its skyscrapers, airplanes, radios, televisions, and computers, was born from this imagination, nurtured in the electric glow. Electricity was not only a tool, but a symbol of human capacity, a beacon of the possible. Yet the transformation carried contradictions. The very success of electrification deepened divisions. Cities gleamed while rural regions waited in darkness. Wealthy nations surged ahead while colonies lagged behind. Access to electricity became a marker of privilege, and its absence a marker of neglect. Even as it unified, it divided. The wires that connected some left others isolated. The benefits were immense but unevenly shared. Progress revealed inequality as much as it revealed advancement. The world also paid costs in the pursuit of power. Electricity demanded coal, oil, water, and later nuclear fuel. The quest to feed the growing grids shaped economies, politics, and even wars. Dams flooded valleys, mines scarred landscapes, smokestacks darkened skies. The electric revolution brought light, but it also brought shadows of dependence, consumption, and environmental strain. The brilliance of modern cities was powered by the labor of miners, the burning of fuel, the altering of rivers. Progress was not without price, and the world forever changed included these costs as well. Still, the overall arc was undeniable. The electric revolution lifted life expectancy, expanded education, enriched culture, and empowered science. Hospitals glowed with sterile light, surgeries became safer, medicines could be refrigerated, knowledge spread through radio and television. Laboratories discovered truths hidden in atoms and stars. Every aspect of human endeavor was touched. Electricity did not merely improve life. It redefined what life could be. The personalities behind the revolution shaped its course, but could not fully contain its destiny. Edison's lamps became global. Tesla's alternating current powered continents. Bell's telephones circled the globe. Yet the spread of power went beyond them. New generations of engineers, entrepreneurs, and dreamers carried the torch forward. The revolution became self-sustaining, an unstoppable current running through history. The inventors passed, but their world endured, glowing brighter with each passing year. By the mid-20th century, electricity had become so ordinary that its marvel was forgotten. What once drew gasps at world's fairs became taken for granted. Children grew up never knowing darkness without lamps, silence without radio, work without motors. The revolution succeeded so thoroughly that it disappeared into normal life. Its greatest triumph was invisibility power, humming quietly in wires, lamps lighting without thought, devices running at a touch. The world forever changed became simply the world. And yet, when one pauses to reflect, the immensity of the change returns. Consider the fact that a single switch today can summon more light than entire medieval villages could muster. A single phone call can span oceans faster than any fleet. A single generator can power a city larger than ancient empires. These realities, so ordinary to us, would have been incomprehensible to our ancestors. They remind us that the revolution was not inevitable. It was made step by step, by minds and hands, by failures and sacrifices, by dreams and persistence. The world forever changed by electricity is our inheritance. It surrounds us in glowing cities and humming machines, and voices carried across wires, in screens that illuminate faces in the dark. It is so constant that we forget its strangeness, so reliable that we forget its fragility. Yet it began not long ago with a few inventors, a few experiments, a few moments of brilliance in dimly lit rooms. From those moments, the shape of modern life emerged. And so, as we reflect on the electric revolution, we see not only a technological story, but a human one. A story of Edison, who refused to give up, of Tesla, who dreamed beyond measure, of Bell, who sought to connect voices, a story of workers stringing wires across streets, of crowds marveling at glowing lamps, of families gathering around new devices in their homes, a story of triumphs that dazzled and struggles that scarred. Above all, it is the story of a world remade, a world where light, sound, and power flow endlessly, invisibly, shaping every moment of modern existence. The world is forever changed. And each time we flip a switch, answer a call, or hear the hum of power, we are touching that change, living within the revolution that began more than a century ago. It is the revolution of Edison, Tesla, Bell, and countless others who carried their ideas into reality. It is the revolution of humanity, refusing to remain in darkness, determined to bring light.